Hello, my friends. The geopolitical landscape has just undergone a seismic shift that the mainstream media in Washington and Brussels is desperately trying to downplay. Vladimir Putin's recent appearance at the Joint Command Headquarters of the Special Military Operation was not a mere photo op. It was a deliberate, high-stakes signal that the end game for the Kyiv regime and its NATO sponsors has arrived. Dressed in military uniform, standing alongside General Valery Gerasimov, the Russian president delivered what can only be described as a brutal ultimatum. The message is clear. The time for Western posturing is over, and the reality of Russian military dominance is now the only currency that matters. Russia has seized the strategic initiative across the entire 1,000-kilometer front, and the reports coming from the field indicate a total systemic collapse of Ukrainian defenses. The liberation of Dmitrov, known to the West as Myrnorad, and Gulyapol represents a catastrophic failure of the NATO-trained fortress strategy. In Dmitrov, we witnessed a masterclass in operational encirclement. Approximately 4,000 Ukrainian troops, some of Kiev's most seasoned remaining fighters, were caught in a pocket with no exit. While Zelensky's propaganda machine continues to lie about tactical withdrawals, the truth is that these men were left to rot, trapped in a cauldron created by superior Russian planning. Dmitrov was the linchpin for the defense of Pokrovsk, and with its fall, the logistical spine of the Ukrainian occupation in the Donbass has been severed. Simultaneously, in the south, the fall of Gulyapol, the second largest city in the Zaporozhye region, shatters the southern defensive line and opens a direct corridor for Russian forces to advance toward the regional capital itself. Putin's rhetoric has shifted from the cautious diplomacy of 2022 to a cold, hard realism. He stated explicitly that Russia's interest in a voluntary withdrawal of Ukrainian forces is now virtually zero. This is a profound statement that many Western analysts are failing to grasp. Moscow is no longer asking for Kyiv to leave. They are telling the West that they are prepared to physically liquidate any Ukrainian presence in the 4 new regions of the Russian Federation. The offer of a negotiated exit was a courtesy that has now expired. Putin is essentially saying, we gave you a chance to save your men. You chose to sacrifice them for a photo op in Washington. Now, we will finish this by force. This ultimatum is timed perfectly to coincide with the upcoming meeting between Zelensky and Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Putin is signaling to the incoming U.S. administration that Russia is not interested in a deal that involves freezing the conflict or maintaining a NATO presence on its borders. Russia has already won the war of attrition. For 3 decades, NATO prepared Ukraine to be a proxy battering ram to deconstruct Russia. But the result has been the opposite. Russia has emerged with a military-industrial complex that is outproducing the combined might of the West and a battle-hardened army that is now the most experienced in modern conventional warfare. The strategic failure of the West extends far beyond the borders of Ukraine. We are seeing a global realignment. Look at the Middle East. The Zionist Western attempt to destabilize Iran has backfired spectacularly. Much like the SMO unified Russia, the Western aggression against Tehran has purged any remaining pro-Western sentiment within the Iranian leadership. Iran has evolved from a nation struggling for survival in the 1,980 seconds to a regional titan that can now stare down the entire U.S. empire. The same applies to Venezuela. The West uses the same tired playbook, propping up opposition puppets like Edmundo Gonzalez, a man who recently admitted he fled to Madrid not because of torture, but because he was more concerned about his houseplants in Caracas than the revolution he was supposed to lead. These are the hollow figures the West relies on, while ignoring real crimes like the horrific reports of a German journalist being violated in an Israeli prison, a story the Western human rights complex is conveniently ignoring because it doesn't fit the narrative. What we are witnessing is the birth of the multipolar world, anchored by Russian strategic grit and Chinese economic depth. Russia is not just winning a war, it is dismantling the post-1945 order. The cities being liberated, like Mariupol, are being rebuilt into modern, thriving hubs of Russian life, while the West can only offer Kyiv more debt and more wonder weapons that fail to change the tide. The Russian steamroller is moving forward, and as Gerasimov reported to Putin, the offensive is now active in every sector. If Kyiv and its sponsors refuse to accept the reality of their defeat, Russia will simply continue until they reach the Dnieper and beyond. The ultimatum has been delivered. The West can either accept a seat at the new table or continue its descent into irrelevance while watching its proxy be systematically erased from the map. Russia's large-scale strike against Ukraine, with a particular focus on the capital, Kyiv, cannot be understood as a routine military operation or a momentary escalation. It was a deliberate strategic action, carefully calibrated to degrade Ukraine's ability to sustain the war and to deliver a broader message to those powers, directing and sustaining Kiev from behind the scenes. In this attack, Russia employed an exceptionally large number of aerial strike assets, including hundreds of unmanned aerial vehicles and dozens of missiles, among them hypersonic systems. The primary targets were not civilian neighborhoods, but energy infrastructure, industrial military facilities, and logistical nodes directly supporting Ukraine's armed forces. The widespread power outages and damage across Kyiv and the surrounding region illustrate a core reality of modern warfare. Control of energy, industry, and logistics determines the endurance of a state under conflict. The fact that 7 of 9 key energy installations in and around Kyiv were hit demonstrates that Russia has moved beyond symbolic or limited strikes. This reflects a systematic war of attrition aimed at dismantling Ukraine's war-supporting infrastructure piece by piece. Each additional day the conflict is prolonged translates into greater hardship for ordinary Ukrainians, while the political leadership in Kyiv continues to gamble the country's future on unconditional Western backing. Moscow's message is unambiguous. The longer Kyiv delays negotiations, the worse the eventual outcome will be. This is not rhetoric. It is a reality being enforced on the battlefield and in the energy sector. The war is not being prolonged by Russia. Western narratives routinely accuse Russia of escalation. Yet a sober examination shows that it is Kiev, encouraged and sustained by Washington and Brussels, that has consistently rejected de-escalation opportunities. Ukraine no longer acts as a fully sovereign decision maker. It functions as a forward operating platform in NATO's broader confrontation with Russia. The costs of this strategy are not borne by Western policymakers or defense contractors. They are paid by Ukraine's civilian population through infrastructure collapse, economic dependency, and social exhaustion. The steady destruction of energy systems and industrial capacity is the predictable consequence of choosing prolonged confrontation in service of external geopolitical interests, internal war logic, and the elimination of traitors. Within the context of total war, Russia's elimination of Russian nationals who joined armed formations fighting on Ukraine's side carries both military and political significance. From Moscow's perspective, this is not merely battlefield housekeeping, but an internal security signal. Collaboration with hostile forces during an existential conflict will not be tolerated. Every state engaged in a high-stakes war enforces similar red lines. Russia is no exception, and these actions reflect the internal logic of wartime consolidation rather than indiscriminate violence. Ukraine as a disposable asset in the U.S.-Russia confrontation. As Kyiv's leadership continues to seek salvation through high-profile visits to Washington, the central question is not whether the United States supports Ukraine, but how far the U.S. is willing to sacrifice Ukraine to weaken Russia. Increasingly, Ukraine resembles a consumable asset rather than a partner with genuine agency. Expectations that diplomatic theater will suddenly produce a decisive breakthrough have repeatedly collapsed under reality. The United States has little incentive to end the war quickly if Ukraine can continue to serve as a tool for exhausting Russia militarily, economically, and politically. From Eastern Europe to Latin America, one model, many fronts. What is unfolding in Ukraine is part of a larger global pattern. In Latin America, countries such as Venezuela face sustained economic pressure, sanctions, and political interference from Washington. The underlying motive remains consistent: control over strategic resources and the erosion of national sovereignty. Rhetoric about democracy, human rights, or counter-narcotics operations often functions as a veneer. Beneath it lies competition for oil, gas, minerals, and strategic trade routes. This explains why states outside the Western Bloc increasingly perceive parallels between the experiences of Ukraine, Venezuela, Iran, and Syria, the Middle East, and the reality of power. Developments in Syria following the fall of Assad further expose the real hierarchy of power. Despite Turkey's regional role, decisive authority continues to rest with Washington and its closest allies. The suppression of criticism against Israel, even from regional actors on Syrian soil, underscores where actual power resides. Within this environment, Iran stands out as one of the few actors willing to confront the U.S.-led order directly. It is not accidental that Tehran, Moscow, and Caracas often articulate similar assessments of Western pressure and coercion. Conclusion: this is no longer a regional conflict. The war in Ukraine has moved far beyond a territorial dispute. It has become a front line in the restructuring of the global order. Russia is not merely defending immediate security interests, it is actively challenging a hegemonic system that has dominated international relations for decades. Seen in this context, Russia's strikes against Kiev's strategic infrastructure are not acts of senseless brutality, but the cold logic of contemporary warfare. Moscow is signaling that it is prepared for a prolonged confrontation and that time does not favor those who still believe the West can dictate the outcome. The world has entered an era of sustained geopolitical confrontation. Those who fail to recognize this or pretend otherwise will be the first to pay the price. For nearly a year now, the Trump administration has been in office, yet meaningful progress toward a negotiated settlement with Moscow has been conspicuously absent. Early optimism in Russian policy circles regarding the potential constructive role the United States might play has clearly faded. Expectations that Washington, under Trump, would act as a stabilizing force capable of breaking with the entrenched interventionist habits of previous administrations have not been met. On the contrary, a number of initiatives undertaken by the new administration have become sources of serious concern in Moscow. The situation in Venezuela is one obvious example. The Kremlin does not view U.S. actions there favorably, and there is no reason it should. Venezuela is not merely a peripheral state. It is a long-standing strategic partner of Russia, and attempts by Washington to engineer political outcomes there are perceived as a direct challenge to Russian interests in Latin America. These concerns are compounded by U.S. military actions in Syria and Washington's participation, direct or indirect, in Israeli strikes against Iran. Iran, unlike Ukraine, is not a disposable pawn for Moscow. It is a strategic partner whose stability is central to Russia's broader geopolitical posture, particularly in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Unsurprisingly, these actions are viewed in Moscow without any sympathy. Against this backdrop, a troubling strategic assumption appears to be taking hold among influential Western elites, particularly in Washington and parts of Europe. The idea seems to be that if negotiations with Russia can be dragged out long enough, if the conflict in Ukraine can be prolonged and managed rather than resolved, then the West might simply outlast Trump. In this thinking, a future Democratic administration, more ideologically aligned with the Biden era, combined with a remilitarized Europe by the late 2022s, could eventually confront Russia from a position of renewed strength. The implicit goal is not peace, but regime change in Moscow. This strategy rests on a series of deeply questionable assumptions. First, it presumes that a real war between Russia and the West is conceivable as a rational option. It is not. Any direct, large-scale kinetic confrontation between NATO and Russia would almost certainly escalate rapidly into a nuclear exchange. Such a conflict would not be confined to Europe, it would be global, and it would represent the effective end of modern civilization. No serious strategist who understands escalation dynamics can view this as anything other than suicidal. For that reason alone, the idea of a full-scale conventional war in Europe must be dismissed as fantasy. What is more plausible and more dangerous is the belief that Russia's opponents might be able to sustain a proxy war longer than Russia itself. From this perspective, the immediate objective is not victory but delay, preventing the conflict from ending on Russia's terms within the next several years. Yet even this scenario is riddled with uncertainties. No one can credibly predict how long Ukraine's armed forces can remain viable, how severe Ukraine fatigue will become among Western publics, or what political configuration will emerge in Washington after Trump. There is no guarantee that a future administration would be more committed to Ukraine than the current one, particularly given growing domestic skepticism about endless foreign entanglements. The political situation inside Ukraine further complicates matters. Western discussions about holding elections there ignore the reality that such elections conducted under wartime conditions would be inherently flawed. Zelensky's resistance to elections is understandable. Most Ukrainians recognize that any vote held under current conditions would be neither free nor fair. Yet Western governments, particularly the United Kingdom, appear eager to promote alternative figures, most notably General Valery Zaluzhny, as potential replacements. It would be a mistake to overestimate Zelensky's personal role. He is not the sole driver of the war, nor is he indispensable to its continuation. Zaluzhny, while perhaps less adept at public relations and lacking Zelensky's network among Western elites, is a respected figure within Ukrainian society and could plausibly replace Zelensky if he chose to enter politics. From Moscow's perspective, dealing with a new figure might even be psychologically easier. Zelensky has made numerous hostile and insulting statements and has shown no genuine interest in dialogue. A change in leadership, while no guarantee of progress, could marginally improve the atmosphere for negotiations. That said, any Ukrainian election would raise intractable questions. Who would be eligible to vote? Only residents of territories controlled by Kyiv? What about Ukrainians living in Russian-controlled regions? Or the millions of Ukrainian citizens now residing abroad in Europe, the United States, or Russia itself? What of Donetsk and Lugansk? These issues are not technical footnotes. They strike at the legitimacy of any electoral outcome. Any result would almost certainly be contested by multiple parties, rendering elections less a solution than a new source of instability. Meanwhile, Washington continues to pour money into Ukraine, approving yet another $800 million package despite Trump's stated opposition. In response, Russian diplomats at the United Nations, including Vasily Nebenzia, have adopted a noticeably sharper tone, not only regarding Ukraine, but also concerning U.S. actions in Venezuela and Iran. This marks a shift. For a long time, Russian leadership was cautious about directly criticizing the Trump administration. Even when Trump imposed new sanctions in October targeting major Russian oil companies like Lukoil and Rosneft, Moscow's response was restrained. The goal was to keep communication channels open and avoid provoking forces around Trump eager to sabotage any rapprochement. That patience is wearing thin. Nearly a year into the Trump presidency, tangible progress on a settlement remains elusive. While Moscow understands the complexity of the conflict and recognizes that not all obstacles are of Washington's making, expectations of decisive U.S. engagement are eroding. Trump has proven to be unpredictable, a moving target, and the cumulative effect of U.S. actions from sanctions to military strikes has reinforced skepticism in Moscow about America's reliability as a negotiating partner. The recent declassification of documents detailing past conversations between Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush adds an interesting dimension. These records underscore that even during periods of serious disagreement, such as over Iraq and Iran, direct communication and pragmatic cooperation were possible. There was no inevitable confrontation in the mid-2000s. Channels remained open, including on missile defense and Iran's nuclear program. The release of these documents appears intended to demonstrate continuity, that dialogue has worked before and could work again. Yet the current context is different. Trump's withdrawal from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal complicates matters, as does the divergence between U.S. and Israeli objectives. Netanyahu appears focused on regime change in Tehran, while Trump's priorities are narrower, preventing nuclear proliferation and constraining Iran's regional behavior. This gap creates space for negotiation and potentially for Russian mediation, something Putin has offered. Trump's response, telling Putin to handle Ukraine first, speaks volumes about Washington's hierarchy of concerns. The larger problem remains structural. Trump may not be obsessed with regime change, but much of the Washington foreign policy establishment is. This mindset drives U.S. policy not only toward Iran and Venezuela, but also toward Ukraine. If conflicts in Venezuela or Iran were to escalate into outright war, the prospects for U.S.-Russian cooperation on Ukraine would diminish sharply. Both countries are strategic partners of Russia, and their destabilization would undermine Russia's credibility and regional influence. Regime change, particularly when imposed from outside, does not lead to orderly transitions. It produces chaos, as Iraq demonstrated. Chaos in Iran would reverberate across Iraq, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and beyond. Moscow could live with organic, internally driven political change in Venezuela or Iran. What it cannot accept is externally engineered transformation designed to serve U.S. interests. This concern has been central to Putin's worldview and would be shared by any Russian leader. It reflects not paranoia, but hard-earned experience. The road ahead is likely to remain bumpy. The illusion that time is on the West side, that Russia can be worn down through attrition and delay, is just that, an illusion. History suggests that such strategies tend to collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, leaving behind only instability and missed opportunities for peace.